Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Patricia Sullivan. I'm a professor of history here at the University of South Carolina, and I welcome you on behalf of UofSc's History Center, the Humanities Collaborative, and the School of Law, all co-sponsors of tonight's program. It is a great pleasure to welcome Louis Steele back to the University of South Carolina. Louis Steele, and this is not an overstatement, is among the country's leading civil rights lawyers. He began his career fresh out of New York Law School in 1963, the peak year of the civil rights movement. It is notable that a close relationship during his childhood to William Rutherford, an African-American man who worked for his family and cared for him, enabled him to see and feel the cruelty and personal costs of what many accepted as America's racial norms. That experience indelibly shaped his life's work, as indicated in the title of his memoir, The Butler's Child. And we do have copies of the book for sale here after the talk. But it was the media images of violent assaults on protesters in the South in the early 1960s that prompted him to volunteer in the office of NAACP General Counsel Robert Carter, a small three-person office with a huge caseload. Robert Carter, as many of you know, was a leading strategist in the legal assault on segregation that culminated with Brown v. Board. Louis proved to be indispensable. He was hired as a full-time attorney just as Carter was launching a campaign to end school segregation in the North. As Steele describes in his remarkable memoir, he immediately found himself on the front lines. On one of his first cases in the summer of 1964, he was sent solo into the Deep South to support a local challenge to a segregated restaurant in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, shortly after 3 civil rights workers were murdered in Mississippi. Mostly he worked on school desegregation and employment discrimination cases in northern cities, and in support of African American demands for community control of public schools in 2 New York neighborhoods. Carter and his team laid a strong legal foundation in several cases for a Supreme Court ruling on northern school segregation, but the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear them. In October 1968, the New York Times published Louis Steele's infamous 9 Men in Black Who Think White, in which he charged that while the court had struck down symbols of racism, it continued to defer to white sensibilities, as seen, for instance, in Brown 2, which offered no time frame for school desegregation and left primary responsibility for enforcement with those who had established and maintained segregation. In response to the article, the NAACP board promptly fired him, and Robert Carter and the rest of the legal staff resigned in protest. The foundation had been laid for what became Louis Steele's lifelong work and pursuit, and a deep and enduring friendship between Louis and Bob Carter, which is a major theme of his memoir. Out on his own after 1968, Louis's work as a civil rights lawyer went forward at a time when mainstay organizations of the movement, like SNCC, began to disband or lose influence at the national level. The deep systemic nature of racial discrimination remained manifest in all areas of American life, in housing, employment, schools, and the criminal justice system, which saw a staggering increase of the black prison population take off in the late 1960s. And as I was thinking about this, I'm thinking about a quote from the great Charles Houston about what it was like in the late 30s before the civil rights movement, as you know, it took off, about what people like Louis, other lawyers and activists did as we moved into this period without the kind of support that had existed prior. Houston talked about people like that keeping the light burning on the peak of absolute equality. This is a quote from Louis. "The desperate situation black people confronted every time they were hauled into criminal court to defend themselves in a world dominated by white people. This became a major focus of Steele's work during this period. Examples include the case of Tony Maynard, which accounted for his presence at Attica in the fall of 1971, the Harlem Four, and the 20-year-long struggle of Reuben Hurricane Carter and John Ardis. Louis and his law partner Dick Bellman mounted a vigorous effort to enforce the Fair Housing Act of 1968, pressing the limits of that legislation and navigating court rulings and delaying tactics. Their Huntington, Long Island case has gone on for more than 35 years. Steele has won several major employment discrimination cases, including the precedent-setting Sumitomo case, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously that American subsidiaries of foreign corporations must obey civil rights laws. Louis Steele remains in the fight as a civil rights lawyer and is actively engaged through his writing and speaking in what has been a major part of his efforts. In his words, quote, to try and help people, especially white people, understand the reality of racism and how it adversely affects all of us, and how destructive it is to our society, our community, and our ideals. So in this spirit, Louis Steele will share his reflections on the 1971 Attica prison rebellion. Please join me in welcoming Louis Steele.
Thank you, Professor Sullivan. You have been really wonderful in setting this whole program up for me, and I hope you all get a sense of what occurred at Attica and how that occurrence relates to what happened afterward and still exists today. Let me just start by clearing out a couple things that I might forget. There's an Attica documentary, which I understand will be on Showtime this Saturday, and it is a gripping documentary, beautifully made, and if you have the time, you should see it. Between it and, I suppose, my remarks, you'll really get a sense of the significance of Attica and why it's so important for all of us. One other thing before I forget, you might, if you have time, and Professor Sullivan said if you email her, she'll send you a copy of an article which I wrote in 2001, which really takes 9 Men in Black and moves it forward. And that article's also published. The first was published by New York Times Magazine. This was published by The Nation in February of 2001, and it's entitled Separate and Unequal by Design. I almost forgot I wrote it, and when I was preparing for this talk, I started looking through old articles and said, oh my God, I really wrote this. So I think if you read it, you will really see how the civil rights law in the Supreme Court deteriorated over time to the point where today, if you're aware of, for example, the voting right cases of the Supreme Court, deterioration is a pleasant word to use to describe what's going on now at the level of the Supreme Court. I'd like, before focusing on Attica and the follow-up, to tell you how I ended up at Attica, because that's key to what occurred at Attica. Earlier that year, another prison in the state of New York at Auburn erupted, and literally the same type of thing happened. The prisoners, Auburn was a maximum security prison. The prisoners there managed to grab a couple of the guards and turn them into hostages, and had an area of the prison that they had control over. In relatively quick negotiations, the prison leadership, the prisoner leadership, agreed to surrender, give up their guards in return for a promise that there would be absolutely no retaliation. Well, that promise turned out to be worthless. The leadership of the prisoner action were immediately taken up to the roof. It was winter in Auburn, freezing cold. They were stripped naked. They were put in cells, and all night long guards would go by the cells with their batons and make sure that no one slept. And so they were in a freezing room. This went on for weeks, and I was preparing to go on a vacation, and a friend of mine called up and knew that I had tried a whole bunch of cases and said, we have a little team of attorneys here that are going to go up and try and literally save the prisoners' lives. And would you come up and be lead counsel? And so I did. Fortunately, there was a psychiatrist who worked with the prison. He was not a employee of the prison system, but he worked with them, and every now and then would be assigned to give some kind of therapy or whatever to prisoners in Attica. And he went up to Attica and saw what was going on. And so I went up on the eve of trial, learned this man's name, called him up on the telephone, and miracle of miracles, he was willing to talk to me. And he told me in no uncertain terms that what was going up there, to his observation, was so serious that some of the men up there might die. And so I said, will you testify? He hemmed and hawed and finally agreed to testify. The judge, the federal judge, was very conservative, immediately set the case down for a hearing. We had already filed papers, set it down for a hearing. We put on some of the prisoners who were up in that freezing cold roof, and they testified about the horror of being up there. And this is in no uncertain terms torture, what was being done to them. And so after, I think, 2 or 3 of them testified, I had subpoenaed the psychiatrist. He had shown up, and I called him as a witness. And he immediately started to hem and haw, well, it was tough on the guards and this and that. And after I let him talk for a while, I said to him, didn't you tell me on the telephone the other day that you went up there and you were worried that the prisoners couldn't survive this? And he said, well, yes, I did tell you And wasn't that true then? And as far as you know, isn't it true now? And he said, yes. And so this federal judge, conservative as he was, can I be heard? Yeah, good. Conservative as he was, now understood that he had a serious matter in front of him. He had an independent witness, and that witness said precisely what we were complaining about, that our group of prisoners up in that freezing cold roof could well perish if the judge didn't grant relief. The judge at a certain point adjourned the case. I knew I had to leave because I had something else I had to do, and the team I was with said, now we can take over. We'll handle the rest of the case. And so I agreed to that, and I left. Before I left, we're up in Auburn, which is upstate New York, and all these prisoners came from the New York City area, which always seemed to happen. Most of the upstate prisoners in New York were New York City people, and most of them were black. And so I said to the judge, Your Honor, these people have been arrested for participating in the takeover, and they need representation. And they can get volunteers in the city of New York who are experienced attorneys, and they will represent them. But to have attorneys volunteer and then come up here and have to, in effect, stay up here is a heavy burden on them. The judge, in his wisdom, immediately responded, well, this is not a horse and buggy day. You can take the train up here. You took the train up here. I'm denying that. I will not transfer them to New York City. Instead, he broke them up. He knew he had to get them out of this prison, and he knew that any order to the guards probably wouldn't be obeyed. And so he scattered some of them around the state. Why do I tell you this? Some of those prisoners were transferred to Attica. So Attica, prisoners soon knew that promises made by the authorities were often worthless. And so in September, when Attica blew up, and you can read in The Butler's Child. By the way, The Butler's Child, let me interrupt myself, has a subheading which is worth thinking about. It's called White Privilege, Race, and a Lawyer's Life in Civil Rights. So let me just switch for a second and talk about, in a sentence or two, white privilege. What does that mean? Do poor whites have white privilege? Or is it only middle class, upper middle class, wealthy class whites that have white privilege? Well, on some level, all your skin has to be is white. And you have an advantage over people whose skin is brown or black. And that advantage, I can just give you one quick example, occurs when the police decide they're going to round up people and accuse them of selling, in those days, marijuana or whatever. wherever, and they are up in Harlem because that's where they think they can make a good catch. And white kids or white adults who aren't up there don't get rounded up, don't get caught, don't get records. And so, is there white privilege here? I think you can all answer that. It's not the privilege of wealth and whiteness, but it certainly gives white people a privilege that will carry over in many areas. In housing, in employment, there are God knows how many test cases where a black name automatically means a rejection in hiring. So white privilege carries through. The book title, therefore, puts white privilege first under the butler's child, and there's a very good reason for it, followed by race, of course, and then a lawyer's life and civil rights, which what I did all my life as a professional. So it's important to keep in your mind Attica followed Auburn, and Auburn led in some small way. I think it probably would have blown up without these prisoners coming up from Auburn and telling what the promise to them was worth. But it sets the stage, and the knowledge that they had, the reality that they knew about, spread like wildfire in the prison. So start with that, keep it in your mind, and let's switch to Attica. Attica is way up there in the north, in New York. It's an old, disgusting prison. It was overcrowded. The food was terrible. Muslims couldn't get a religious figure in there to help them with their religion. The doctor would see patients through a screen and generally would give everyone aspirin, no matter what was wrong with them. Imagine it. What could be terrible in a prison like Attica, and you will probably put your finger on it. Other things which should be in your mind, no due process. So if a guard decides you should be punished for whatever, you got punished for whatever. And if the guards decide, and they were the decider in virtually all these cases that would come before them, that you should be thrown in solitary, you were thrown in solitary. And if the guards decide you should stay in solitary for long periods of time, you stayed in solitary. That was Attica. So the commissioner of corrections in the state of New York was a guy named Russell Oswald. He came in with a relatively liberal reputation, and he heard that the prisoners up there were demanding relief from some of the horrors that were going on up there. And he said he was willing to listen. He was willing to take some steps to make their lives better, to alleviate what was going on. And he said he recognized that they were human beings and therefore were entitled to be treated as human beings. The problem was he didn't follow up on that. And that only created more resentment, that the commissioner articulated some of the things they were articulating themselves, and yet when it came to the follow-up, there was none. And so the prison exploded over an incident between a guard in a prison, and it erupted in a way which allowed other prisoners to break out of their cells. A cage door collapsed. The prison was old. People spilled out. And before the initial event was over, they were in control of one of the main yards in the prison, and they had about 40 hostages. One very seriously injured, couple with relatively minor injuries. They're now the hostages, they're now the prisoners. And the prisoners in that yard rather quickly came up with a group of people to be the leaders. And one thing which is important to think about, the prison leadership by and large was made up of serious individuals, most of whom had some reasonable education, and most of whom understood that the only way out of the situation was through settlement. And so they set up a table in D Yard, this big yard. There were now 1,300 people in that yard. And they maintained order. And they had their prisoners, and they didn't want anything to happen to them. And they got some people who were Muslim, who became the guards for the prisoners, and they did a good job. So in the 5 days that the revolt went on, these prisoners were guarded so that no one could go near them. And again, to understand the situation they were functioning in, a lot of the prisoners, especially in a max like Attica, have serious mental conditions that are, of course, untreated. So when you have 1,400 men in the yard, I would say maybe 60% or so were black, another 25% were probably brown, Latinos, and the rest were white. So you had all three groups. And the commissioner, Russell Oswald, did display in the beginning some very real courage. He went in there, and they could have grabbed him. They promised that they would not grab him. At one point, he went in there 2 times. At one point, a couple of the prisoners in the yard said, "Let's grab him, let's make him a hostage." And the leadership said, no, we promised safe passage in and out for him, and that's the way it's going to be. And the prisoners not only maintained that for him, I ended up being an observer. So why was I an observer? Well, I'd been in Auburn, and I knew something about the drill from my experience there, and the prison leadership had called for observers, and they called the organization I worked with at that time, which was the National Lawyers Guild, and they immediately called me up and asked me to go and represent them up there, and I agreed and went on up. So that's why I was in Attica. That's the Auburn story. That's what the yard looked like. And I saw the photograph outside of the men in the yard. I suppose the other thing you should be aware of, yeah, there were 1,300 people in the yard, but there weren't 1,300 people with their arms in the air, and there weren't 1,300 people that caused the revolt. Most just spilled out of their cells. They were in the yard. All the prison cells were opened. They spilled out, and they had a touch of, I guess you could call it fantasy freedom. Could walk around, no one told them what to do except leave the hostages alone, don't interfere with the observers who then, including myself, started to come in to talk to them, to find out what they wanted, to see if we could do something for them. And they had already negotiated with Oswald some of the key points that they were interested in, some of which by the way, Oswald agreed to. Okay, I'll do that, I'll do this, we'll try to do that. Most of the things that involved money required legislative approval. So even if Oswald was willing to negotiate many of the 29 points, lots of them were maybe yes, maybe no, if the money was there. No money, no better medical care, no better food, no better this, no better that. But he promised quickly, and the prisoners said, but the real issue here is amnesty. Because one way or another, you could arrest and try virtually everyone in here, all 1,300 people in here who committed one crime or another, or who you could accuse of committing one crime or another. So amnesty is important. And we went back and talked to Oswald about that, but by this time, the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, had taken over, sent his minions up to Attica. They were on the phone with him constantly. He indicated to them what he wanted done, and essentially he wanted this over quickly, and communicated that to him. And so Oswald said, we've got to resolve this quickly. We've got to resolve this quickly. Well, we did negotiate some of the 29 points had not been agreed upon in the very beginning. Over the next day or so, they were put on the table. Most of them were approved, all but one. And that was any form of amnesty. And I had, I was sort of low man on the totem pole. I was a young guy. And one of our observers was a state senator who was involved with running the prisons. He turned out to be a help. Another was Clarence Jones, who had been Martin Luther King's lawyer, and at one time or another had also been on Governor Rockefeller's payroll. Rockefeller was a smart guy. He knew that he had endless money, and what better thing for him to do than to retain some African-American lawyers and have them become loyal to him. William Kunstler became an observer, a whole bunch of different people, some young lords, some serious people interested in negotiating. I ended up negotiating, as far as I can tell, looking at the end result of our negotiations, which I think are in the appendix to Blood in the Water, Heather Thompson's fantastic book on Attica. And I had said, come on, you can arrest everyone here for either leaving their cells, breaking some window, doing something wrong. And so let's start off by saying that you won't try people for damaging prison property. And maybe a day later they said, okay, we agree, but nothing else. Those are instructions, and we're going to follow them. And the 3 or 4 leaders of the observers who were well known. One was a former congressman, well-known guy, Republican. Others had connections to the prison system. All of them said, no, let's see what we can negotiate. And the answer always came back, that's it. No more negotiations. We've given you the 29 points. Surrender your hostages, return to your cells, and we will not physically retaliate against you, as occurred in Auburn. And the leadership in our group said, no, we won't agree to that. Let's negotiate. That went on, and Rockefeller, probably in the 3rd or 4th day, started saying it's got to end now. And you could see there's a photograph. I don't know if you've got it in your bank of photographs, but a photograph literally of an army of state troopers and prison guards marching into Attica. And when the shooting started, they went up at the top of the yard. There was a place that looked right directly down into the yard. So they lined up on all sides behind a parapet. Prisoners could see them up there. They wanted to be seen. And Rockefeller was saying, oh, you got to surrender. We're going to go in. And the prison leadership really didn't believe him, because if you went in with all the armaments you had, and started shooting, you'd kill your own guards, your own hostages. And so they thought they could bargain using that. And they assumed that the prison leadership and Rockefeller wouldn't kill their own people. And so they thought they had some leeway to bargain. And as we will see, they did not. They had no power, no ability, no way to stop what happened. So literally the day before the massacre, and that's the only thing you can call it, or maybe the murder, four of the leading observers that had credentials that Nelson Rockefeller knew, some he knew personally, some were liberals like Tom Wicker of the New York Times, some were Republican at that period of time, a Republican who probably called himself a liberal, and others were somewhat in the middle. Four people called him up. They begged him to come to Attica, certainly not to go inside the prison, but to show the prisoners that whatever resolutions were made, they were made with the approval of the governor, and the governor was there to tell them that that was true. He refused. Said they've got to surrender immediately. This is over. I want this done with. Thank you very much for your service, and goodbye. And so, by the way, these people said, if you don't come up, there's this army up there on the parapets, and they're armed with animal rifles, hunting rifles. They're armed with shotguns. They've got every conceivable weapon. The four people to a person told Rockefeller, you've got to come up, you've got to help us negotiate this. Rockefeller said, absolutely not. This is over. And truth was, it was over. I'm using the word our people. To some extent, the people that were negotiating were our people. They were reasonable. They were honorable. They allowed observers to come in and out. They allowed Oswald to come in and out when they knew that if they grabbed him, they would now have a real bargaining chip. They refused to do that. They showed themselves as being men of their word. But it all didn't matter. The next day, a helicopter came over and dropped a whole bunch of things into the yard, including smoke bombs. And then around 9:30 in the morning, they were given a signal, and you can hear the tape. You must see the movie. You must see the documentary. You hear the shooting going on, literally for what sounds like minutes. And you can't see in the yard now because of the smoke. And that shooting is what ended up killing nine hostages and 29 of the prisoners and wounding hundreds. The interesting thing is they didn't know who they were killing when they started the shooting because all you could see was smoke. and they were shooting blindly into that yard with 1,300 people in it, plus their own prisoners. A little comment, probably as an order, about white people who were involved in what was going on. We were way up north, outside of Buffalo, maybe 2-3 hours by car, outside 2 hours by car. And everyone was white. Everyone, not 99%, everyone in that rural town of Attica was white, and virtually all the workers worked at the prison in one job or another. And when we went in and out, which the observers sometimes did when it became late at night, and we went to a motel, generally with a couple cars following us, like maybe you've heard during the Civil Rights era, civil rights workers in the South. And by the way, I think the North is as guilty as the South of racism in every form, and we're talking now about northern New York. But in the South, during the Civil Rights era, if you were driving anywhere, you pretty much could guess that you would have a following car. And you see what happened with some of those following cars when the kids were killed outside of Philadelphia, Mississippi. So that was scary. But we would go back and forth, and when we would come back to the prison, especially in the last day or so, there would be crowds of people outside the prison, the wives, the mothers, the people who were relatives or had some relationship to the hostages, yelling and screaming at us, despite the fact that what we were trying to do was work out a settlement which could save their lives. But they wanted to see this army that was being assembled go in and wipe out these people, wipe out these prisoners. And they were calling them all the names that you can imagine white people call black people. They're animals, and they're this, and they're that, and it was frightening. The army in the inside kept building. And the observers were locked in a room in the administration building in the inside, and so we heard the fire, but we couldn't see what was happening, and we heard the helicopter go over. Just surrender and nothing will happen. Well, no one was given a chance to surrender. And what the prisoners did, you'll read about it if you follow up on my talk. The prisoners put knives out around the necks of some of the hostages, in effect saying, you don't want to do this. And what occurred afterward, by the way, not one of the hostages had his neck cut. The prison authorities immediately released a statement to the press that Yes, some of the hostages died, but they all had their throats cut. They all had their throats cut. And fortunately, a doctor who did the examinations wouldn't go along with that. And so you had the lie and the cover-up and the doctor who refused to go along with it. And then you had, and you'll see it in the film, the firing finally stopped. And God knows how many of these guards and state police swarmed into the prison, took all the clothes off of everyone in the prison. You see them naked in the film. They made them crawl through the mud. It had been raining. They beat them. They threatened to kill some of them. They actually did kill two of them, as far as we can figure, who, for reasons that the book explains, they wanted to kill. And what occurred was a massacre. It's the only word you can use, and it was a multiple murder. And Rockefeller was responsible in any way that you can imagine. Either some of you are going to be lawyers. There's just no question about the guilt of anyone who ordered that attack, knowing what had to happen. I mean, it was intentional. It was, I think, at a level above felony murder, but at least a felony murder. And finally, they got everyone in the cells. They beat on the cells. They did all the type of stuff that went on at Auburn. And a federal judge ordered them to stop. They declined to follow the order. The judge never held anyone in contempt for failing to obey his order. And so Attica remains to this day in my mind as a horror story that I participated in as an observer, and along with my fellow observers failed to reach some kind of resolution, not because we didn't try, not because even the conservatives among us tried, but because Rockefeller had a program. And his program was to show these people that this is what would happen to them if they rebelled, that there was no out for them, that they would be, in effect, destroyed one way or the other as a result. And so Attica becomes one of the few examples, I've really tried to think it through, where you can trace what occurred to the highest level of government, to Nelson Rockefeller, the governor of New York, one of the wealthiest men in the world, and also a man who wanted to be president of the United States. And how could he do that? He knew what those mothers and family members, although where their minds were at, they were asking for the army to go in there. And they were asking to have their own children and husbands killed. A form of insanity which to this day I can't resolve in my mind how they did that. Why didn't they say you have to settle this so we can get our husbands and children out of there? And by the way, at the very last day, at the end of that day, the observers sent in 3 or 4 people, including people like Tom Wicker, and we had cameramen who were allowed in, and they interviewed the prisoners, and you could see that the prisoners, being the hostages rather, they could see that they were all in good shape, and they all said the same thing. Now, you'd expect them to say that. Please keep negotiating. Help us resolve this to get a way out. The prisoners aren't hurting us. They're guarding us. Don't stop negotiating. Resolve this. And there are tapes of that as well. And Rockefeller said, no. And that's what happened at Attica. Now, the follow-up is the state indicted, I think, about 50, 75 people. I was not part of that. And no guards, no leadership. Only one side got indicted, and it was not the side that caused the massacre. Now, when you think about massacres, you might think, if you've been reading newspapers recently, about Tulsa, which was a massacre. But it was not a massacre that was organized by the leadership, that had the leadership of Tulsa approve it. And most massacres that I'm aware of are in the same situation. So in the Civil War, for example, in New York City, whites massacred blacks who were living in New York City because they were angry that the Union was trying to draft some of them. And so they went on a rampage, but the leadership didn't approve it. The only situation that I can think was approved by the leadership was Attica. And that's why you should know about Attica, because Attica represents a form of systematic, intentional racial discrimination of the worst sort, approved of, executed by, and then indicted the prisoners, and not a single one of the authorities that had anything to do with the massacre. So you see racism in its extremity, but you also see the townspeople in that town. You see the guards and the state police, all of whom who were involved in that attack were white. You see them engaging in, I guess you could call it a turkey shoot or something like And that's a form of intentional, institutional racism that still exists in many ways in this country. You see it, by the way, if you try and find in the newspapers articles, there aren't many, about how maximum security prisons all over this country, not only in New York, but in virtually any state, operate. You will see them operate the way it did then. And Oswald, rather than saying, okay, this is horrible, the least we can do is make your prison conditions a little better. No, he said exactly the opposite. We will tighten the reins. And to this day, the reins are tightened. The prisons are more overcrowded now. They're in worse condition now. Solitary exists in virtually every state. There's no due process at all for prisoners. And we tolerate that every day. Every one of us. Every one of us turns our back on that because we want to be safe. And as far as we're concerned, they're out of sight, out of mind. And that's where we want them to be. And that's where they are to this day. So, Attica is something that you should know something about. And that perhaps if you have a chance, you might try and figure out, is there anything you can do, either by organizing as a lawyer or any other method, to alleviate the horrors of what American prisons are like as we sit in this room together. So let me finish. I know I've probably gone over my time, but I'm a lawyer, and therefore I pretend to obey the rules with regard to time and continue on, and hopefully what I'm telling you is worth your hearing. There are a few other little pieces I'd like to at least put out on the table. One, and if you see the documentary, you'll see a piece of it. There's a Rockefeller-Nixon tape in which Rockefeller explains to Nixon what he did. Nixon said, well, was it a black thing? And Rockefeller said, yeah, it was a black thing. Nixon thought about it and said, well, you had to do it. It's on the tape. You had to do it. You had to murder not only prisoners, but your own people. Just incredible. So Attica is right out there if you want a terrible example of what racism does. And you see the racism in the people in the town, perfectly good people. The documentary shows them going to weddings, having fun, enjoying all the things that we enjoy in our spare time. And you look at these people and their families and you say, they're just like us. They're just like us. So we have to dig in deep when we consider racism and consider what we should do about it. One other word, am I going too long for you, or do you mind if I go on a little longer? Okay. I have written a note to myself that you might be interested in critical race theory. And you can be interested in that on certain levels. One, on the propaganda that has been sweeping the country about how 5-year-old and 7-year-old children are being taught to hate and hate themselves and grow up to be, oh my God, look what we did. Critical race theory has nothing to do with 5 and 7-year-olds. It has to do with maybe people in college, certainly people in law school, certainly people in graduate school. And that's on one level. On another level, you're talking a theory. You're talking a theory, and from my perspective, fighting racism is very difficult. But if you keep doing it, you see glimmers of progress. And I'll point out one glimmer. Some of you might not agree with this, but to me it's important. When there were the recent events about the 6-minute killing of somebody in custody, a black man in custody, by a policeman who fortunately was convicted of the killing. When you see that, you can get some understanding of how racism plays out on multiple levels. Well, that's how it played out with that person. Now, that person might be an anomaly, might be different than all the other police, but probably there are other police out there that have the same racial attitudes. And so you're not condemning all police, and you're not saying you don't want police, but you are saying that the society has to work on what policing means, how to do it, and how to do it without killing people. You've got to, when you're told critical race theory means everyone's guilty, we're all racists, we're all this, we're all that. Well, to some extent, we probably are all this and all that. But that doesn't mean we're bad people. It means we're part of our society. We have to learn. We have to struggle. We have to talk to each other. We have to talk to other people. We have to do what we can do to work through whatever our racial feelings are, to try and see if we can make this a more egalitarian nation where we don't have to fight over race all the time, where we can understand that virtually all the things that, like welfare, oh my God, payments to welfare, well, there are more whites on welfare than blacks. So we oppose welfare. We don't like it because it's giving black people our tax money. White people need it too. You can look at all of these things with a broader brush, a broader way of seeing, and you can be part of the solution. And you can help all of us try and move forward, because we sure as hell need that. And thank you. Oh, I'd love questions. I can't answer them, but I'll try. Can you can you pull your mask down? Well, if I understand your question, the legal side is okay. A murder occurred, and there was no response to the murder, and people were tried. The whole thing was one-sided. The whole thing was bad. From a human side, I think what I said earlier is true. From where most of us are sitting here in this room, we have silently approved of what's done in our name. And from a human side, it's hard to break that because it's easy to say, well, they're prisoners, they did something wrong, they might have done something bad wrong, they deserve this. Well, I understand that argument, and you have to decide in your own heart how you deal with the human side.
Louis, he asked you a different question.
Oh,
and
I'm
the microphone
sorry.
wasn't working.
Probably didn't hear
But it's
it.
something you talked about yesterday that was really an important question. What is thinking about the social movements of the past year and around George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, what's the relationship between social movements and lawyering? Was that pretty much it?
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I missed the question. Progress has basically been made in my opinion, when the human side, in terms of people coming together to affect change, work with lawyers. And one of the difficulties that lawyers have had, literally, can't put an exact date on it, but when Martin Luther King was killed, and by the way, if you get a chance, you should read Professor Sullivan's book on Bobby Kennedy and how he was developing himself to try and become a human being who could deal with some of these problems. Now, he was a big shot. And it's interesting, in a tiny way, I'm a little shot. He's a big shot. We both had the same idea that we would use our white privilege to try and make progress. And we won't make real progress until there's some organization supporting us. And so when the Black Lives Matter movement blossomed, and I saw in the streets young whites and young blacks marching together, it heartened me. I saw the possibility that there could be a rebirth of the movement that existed when I was young and first becoming a civil rights lawyer. And we marched together and sang blacks and whites together. This country desperately needs blacks and whites to understand it's in both of their interests to march together, to sing together, to want to create a society that's more egalitarian, where we're not at each other's throats all the time, where we understand the problems each of us have and try and work to solve them, lawyers by themselves, especially in a time when you have a very, very conservative Supreme Court. Can't do a thing unless we organize.
How did this episode in Attica, or this series of events, how did that... Oh, sorry.
I have hearing problems, so if you can talk as loudly as you can, that would help me.
How did this series of events in Attica influence the way that you thought about the law or the process of law, and did it also affect your direction of work?
Pat, did you? Well, you know, my view of the law is the law should do what it says, which is require equality as much as possible. And the law simply does not do that now. Attica only makes me work harder. You know, the last thing I feel like I wanted to do I'm 84. I still handle a certain type of civil rights case. I handle cases involving people who did their time in prison and can't get employed because they have a record even when the record does not relate in any way to the job they want, or the record is 10 years old or 5 years old, or the record involves a form of drug that is legal now, or a form of drug where there's a different drug that white people, coke, for example, take. What am I going to do, run and hide? No, you get out there and you can do what you can do. And this room has a bunch of people, I understand, who are law students or graduates. There's work out there for you to do. And you're young people. And you got to do that work so that we can all live in a better country.
So specifically in South Carolina and here in Columbia, the jail, the local jail, is named for a guard that was killed during a riot. Alvin S. Glenn, the jail facility for Richland County is named for a guard that was killed during a prison riot. How do you think something like that and the namesake of the jail affects how the guards are viewing their prisoners?
I miss, Pat's my interpreter. She knows that.
I can do it without the microphone. It's probably better. It's got a little bit of a reverb. The local jail here in Columbia, Alvin S. Glenn, is named for a guard that was killed during a riot at the same facility. How do you think the namesake of the jail and just things like that affect how guards are viewing their prisoners? So the jail is named for a guard who was killed during a prison riot.
Okay. I'm not sure. I think, for example, if you have in Richmond, Virginia, a huge monument to Robert E. Lee, you take the goddamn thing down. It's an insult to any black person who sees it, and it's an insult to me. We fought a civil war over that. And there is this guy prancing on his horse up there. They did take it down. That was good. Can you take everything down? No. Are you going to be left with some things that are, quote, inappropriate, end quote? Yeah, more than likely. You got to choose what you do. Oh, it's terrible. Yeah. Let me answer your question a different way. If you said to me, would I rather see you get involved in trying to alleviate prison conditions, perhaps by forming a citizens committee that would look at the prisons and try and inspect them and talk to people, would I rather see you do that than fight over taking the person's name down? What do you think I would choose? That's the answer to your question. Thank you all.